On behalf of the Chautauqua Women's Club Contemporary Issues Forum, I am honored to introduce our speaker today, Lawrence Lessig. Lawrence is the director of the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University and a professor of law at Harvard Law School. Previously, he was a professor at Stanford Law School and was the founder of Stanford's Center for Internet and Society. For much of his academic career, Lawrence has focused on law and technology, especially as it affects copyright. He is also the author of 5 books on that subject. He has served as lead counsel in a number of important cases, marking the boundaries of copyright law in a digital age. His current academic work addresses the question of institutional corruption, defined as influences within an economy of influence that weaken the effectiveness of an institution or weaken public trust. His 2 most recent books are Republic Lost, How Money Corrupts Congress and a Plan to Stop It, and One Way Forward, The Outsider's Guide to Fixing the Republic. Lawrence earned a BA in Economics and BS in Management from the University of Pennsylvania, an MA in Philosophy from Cambridge, and a JD from Yale. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Lawrence Lessig.
Thank you, and it's an honor to be here. You know, when I was a kid, I dreamed of being a preacher, but no church would have me, so I didn't become a preacher. But when I saw this place that I had a chance to speak today, I was inspired to frame my talk in the way that a preacher might by beginning with 2 quotes here in the Hall of Philosophy. 2 quotes from the sacred texts of philosophers gone by. So, the first, Albert Einstein. Insanity, Einstein said, is doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting different results. That's the first quote. Here's the second. Henry David Thoreau. There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root. Okay, those are the quotes. Here's their meaning. In about 2 weeks, exactly 2 weeks and 2 days, it will be 4 years since a relatively young, relatively inexperienced Barack Obama was selected by the Democratic Party over Hillary Clinton, over a much more seasoned, much more astute, much more long-suffering Hillary Clinton. Now that choice was a choice between 2 very different visions. One, Senator Clinton's, promising to fight for democratic values, and the other, Senator Obama, who in addition to fighting for democratic values said that he would change the way Washington works. San Diego, May 2007, he said this, quote, "If we do not change our politics, if we do not fundamentally change the way Washington works, then the problems we've been talking about for the last generation will be the same ones that haunt us for generations to come." Washington, April 2008. But let me be clear, this isn't just about ending the failed policies of the Bush years. It's about ending the failed system in Washington that produces those policies. For far too long, through both Democratic and Republican administrations, Washington has allowed Wall Street to use lobbyists and campaign contributions to rig the system and get its way, no matter what it costs ordinary Americans. Columbia, South Carolina, January 2008. We are up against the belief that it's all right for lobbyists to dominate our government, that they are just part of the system in Washington. But we know that the undue influence of lobbyists is part of the problem, and this election is our chance to say we're not going to let them stand in our way anymore. And Philadelphia, April 2008. If we're not willing to take up that fight, the fight to change the way Washington works, then real change, change that will make a lasting difference in the lives of ordinary Americans, will keep getting blocked by the defenders of the status quo. And in Indianapolis that same month, he said, "The reason I am running for president is to challenge this system." Now, I was a supporter of Barack Obama. He was a colleague of mine at Chicago. He's a friend. But the striking fact about this administration is that we've seen no change in the way Washington works. Not a single bill was proposed by President Obama to change the way Washington works. Not one idea was advanced to change this corruption. Now, when I use the word corruption, many people say, isn't that a bit harsh? Isn't it a little unfair to talk about our representatives and say that they're corrupt? But let me be clear about what I mean by corruption. I'm not talking about Rod Blagojevich corruption. I'm not talking about Randy Duke Cunningham corruption. I'm not talking about William Jefferson corruption. I'm not talking about any criminal act. There's not any criminal figure in the line of people who I would criticize for leading our government down this road of corruption. There is no crime here. Instead, by corruption, I'm talking about good souls, decent people, but people acting in a way, in plain sight, to corrupt this system of government. It's not illegal corruption I'm talking about. It's legal corruption I'm talking about. Now, what could that mean, legal corruption? Well, to introduce this idea that I'm sure is familiar to everybody, come with me to a place called Lesterland. You don't know, but my first name is Lester, so here we're going to go. We're going to go to Lesterland. Now, it turns out Lesterland, like the United States, is a place where 0.05% of the people are named Lester. There are only 144,000 of us in this country right now. That's 0.05% of the population. But in Lesterland, unlike the United States, Lesters have a very special power. For in Lesterland, in each election cycle, there's actually two elections. There's a Lester election, and then there's a general election. In the general election, everybody gets to vote. If you're over 18, you register. Some states, if you have an ID card, you get to vote. But in the Lester election, only Lesters get to vote. And to run in the general election, you've got to do very well in the Lester election. Not necessarily win, but do very well. So first the Lester election, then the general election. Okay, now, here's what we can say about Lesterland. First, it's obviously true that the people have, quote, ultimate control, as the Supreme Court said in Citizens United, ultimate control over their government, because the last election, everyone gets to vote, the people get to vote, so they have ultimate control over our government. But obviously, and second, that control, that choice that the people have, has been narrowed by the choice made by the Lesters. It's a system dependent upon the Lesters, this world I've described as Lesterland, and we all know, it's obvious what the effect of that system would be. You would expect the politicians, in subtle and understated and absolutely camouflaged way, to constantly bend to the will of the Lesters, to keep the Lesters happy, to give them the constant attention the Lesters need so that the Lesters reward them with what they need, namely the chance to run in an election and get selected by the people. Constant and focused, because this system produces a dependency. We can say of Lesterland that the elected representatives are dependent upon the people, but they're also dependent upon the Lesters. Or we could say they're dependent upon the people, but they're not dependent upon the people alone. They're dependent upon the people and upon the Lesters. Now, you're wondering why I'm using this strange formulation, dependent upon the people alone. And I'm using that formulation because that was incredibly important. That way of thinking about a republic was incredibly important to our framers. The framers gave us what they called a republic. But by a republic, they meant a representative democracy. And by a representative democracy, they meant, as Federalist 52 explains, a government with a branch that would be, quote, dependent upon the people alone. Now, in this sense, this obvious sense, Lesterland is not a republic. Because in Lesterland, the government's not dependent upon the people alone. In Lesterland, they're dependent upon the people and the Lesters. Okay, I know this is sad for you. We're going to leave Lesterland now. We're going to come back to the United States. And this is even more sad. Here's the fact. America is worse than Lesterland. Worse than Lesterland. In America, like in Lesterland, we have two elections. But in America, we have the money election and the voter election. In America, like in Lesterland, to run in the voter election, you've got to do extremely well in the first, the money election. And in America, like in Lesterland, the first election, the money election, is controlled by a tiny slice of the American public. Indeed, we could say, like in Lesterland, it's controlled by 0.05% of the American public. Now, that's a hard number to calculate. Here, you figure out where it should be. Here are the facts. In America today, 0.26%. I know you're thinking he's a lawyer, doesn't know how to do fractions, but I really mean 0.26%. 0.25% of Americans give more than $200 in a congressional election. 0.05%, we Lesters, 0.05% give the maximum amount to any congressional candidate. 0.01%, the 1% of the 1%, give $10,000 or more in an election cycle. And in this presidential election cycle so far, 47 Americans, part of this group right here, has given 42% of the super PAC contributions spent so far. 47 Americans. So 0.26, 0.05, 0.01, 47 Americans giving 42%. I think the average of 0.05 is good enough for my point, because here is the obvious point we've got to see. We've built a democracy where our elected representatives become obsessed with the Lesters in our democracy. Members of Congress spend between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to get back into Congress. As any of us would, they develop in that process a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do might affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shape-shifters, as they constantly adjust their views in light of what they know will help them to raise money, not on issues 1 through 10, but on issues 11 through 1,000. Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes that when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, "Always lean to the green." And then to clarify, she went on, "He was not an environmentalist." So I say that this system in America is worse than Lesterland Because we might imagine in Lesterland, the Lesters become a little bit proud of their status, become a kind of aristocracy within that world. They're kind of randomly selected from society, so they begin to think, well, maybe we should be acting in the interest of the public as a whole. We've been given this great honor to select the candidates that get to run with the people. We will choose those who will serve the republic. But in our world, where it's the 0.26, the 0.05, the 0.01, the 47 constituting 42% of super PAC contributions, they aren't thinking about the public good. They're a shifting coalition of the few who use their resources to bend government's policy, thinking too many about themselves, not about what's in the public good. Because when the Lesters of our democracy get a tax rate for hedge fund managers that's lower than the tax rate my secretary pays, when he gets subsidies for big oil while blocking research for clean energy, when they get the biggest bailout in human history for Wall Street banks, with practically nothing for the millions who suffered because of the recklessness of Wall Street banks, when they offer only skepticism about global warming, which I agree today we might be skeptical about global warming, but even in the midst of the hottest summers in the history of recorded human history, when they do all of this, they're doing it not for us. Not for us. They're doing it for them. When they do this, they show that this system is corrupted. Corrupted relative to the framers of our Constitution's baseline. Corrupted relative to the dependence they intended our government to have. They meant a government that would be dependent upon the people alone. We got a government that is dependent upon the people and the funders. And the funders are not the people. The place of the funders in this system corrupts this democracy. It is the corruption. Now, my view is this is what Obama was talking about. This is why he told us we needed to take up that fight. This is why he said that if we didn't take up that fight, quote, the problems we've been talking about for the last generation will be the same ones that haunt for generations to come. This is why he ran, in my view. This explains at least part of why he won. Yet 4 years later, nothing has been done. He's run his administration in the same way Hillary Clinton would have run hers. Run things the same way they've always been run. The same as it ever was, as the greatest philosopher in the 20th century, David Byrne, put it, same as it ever was. Evoking, again, the opening text from Einstein. If insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over again, expecting different results, then this is insanity. We are never going to get what we want on the right or the left, so long as this is our system of government. Never. On the right or the left. And to believe that we will, again and again and again, is to betray the insanity that this system has evolved. Now let me pause for a second, because some people hear this kind of argument and think this is an argument that only people on the left should care about. I said on the right and the left. And it's easy to see why people on the left get frustrated by this system of corruption. It's easy to see the list of issues that they are most passionate about: global warming, healthcare, financial reform, food safety, environmental safety. It's easy to see how the corrupting influence of money makes it impossible for them to get reform in those areas. But it's also easy to see how principled people on the right cannot get what they want from this government so long as this corruption is allowed to survive. So if you're a principled person on the right, for example, you might believe we should have a system of simpler taxes or smaller government. So let me tell you two stories. 2010, the Wall Street Journal ran a piece about the rise of the, quote, temporary tax code and what they described as extender mania in the tax code. Now, what they were referring to is the fact that our tax code is increasingly filled with these little exceptions and loopholes that have an expiration date. So there's a special tax benefit for a certain kind of investment, and it expires in a year or in 2 years. And at the end of that period, there's a push to extend that special benefit, an extender. And what the Wall Street Journal did in this wonderful piece was to graph the extenders, and there has been an explosion of extenders. And they said, what is this about? Why is there this new dynamic inside of our tax code? Well, it turns out Ronald Reagan gave us the first temporary part to our tax code. In 1981, they created the Research and Development Tax Credit, but they made it temporary so as to test whether or not it would work. Because the Democrats said it wouldn't do any good, it would just cost a lot of tax revenue. The Republicans said no, it would inspire new investment, and it therefore was a good part of the tax system. So they said, okay, let's just try it. And then after a number of years, we'll ask economists, Democrat and Republican economists, to tell us, did it work? And after a number of years, they had a review, and the economists universally said it was a beautiful tax idea. It was a great tax credit idea because it spurred a kind of investment that otherwise would not have been spurred, and it should certainly, they concluded, be part of our tax system. Here's the puzzle. More than 30 years after that conclusion, this research and development tax credit is still a temporary part of our tax code. So why is that? Well, law professor Rebecca Kaisar, in this piece she published in the Georgia Law Review, gave us a little clue of why this might be. As she writes, quote, the principal recipients of the research credit are large U.S. manufacturing corporations. These business entities, she writes, are more than willing to invest in lobbying activities and campaign donations to assure the continuance of this very large tax savings. Or the right-wing Institute for Policy Innovation puts it a little bit more sharply. They say, quote, this cycle has repeated for years. Congress allows the credit to lapse until another short extension is given, preceded, of course, by a series of fundraisers and speeches about the importance of nurturing innovation. Congress essentially uses this cycle to raise money for re-election, promising industry more predictability the next time around. And it dawns on you, this dynamic, a dynamic which is central to how Washington works, means that we are architecting our tax policy in part to make it easier to raise campaigned funds. And it's not just tax policy. Here's the second story. Our communications policy is governed by the Telecommunications Act, which was originally enacted in its current version in 1934. It has 6 separate titles. Title II deals with what we used to think of as telephones, those things that are tied to a wall, and you pick them up, and they usually worked, right? Title VI deals with cable. So the internet, of course, comes across telephone wires. DSL is broadband across telephone wires, and it also comes across cable wires. So Al Gore, when he was vice president, shortly after he invented the internet, he decided, that's unfair, and I'm totally silly, ridiculous, I'm sorry. So after he became vice president, he decided he wanted to start an initiative to reframe the way these crucial parts to the regulatory infrastructure for the internet would be designed. So he had the idea of taking the internet part of Title II and the internet part of Title VI and putting it together under a new Title VII. And that new Title VII would be completely deregulated. And the idea was, if we completely deregulate it, that will create lots of incentive for new competitors to come in. Now, whether you believe this or not, this is the important fact. When he had this idea and his chief staff member took it to Capitol Hill, this is the response the staffer got as he reported to me 2 years ago. The answer he got was, quote, hell no. How are we going to raise money from these guys if we deregulate them? how are we going to raise money if we deregulate them? Now, simple people have a word for this. It's called extortion. Extortion. Because what this is imagining is the very opportunity to be regulating these businesses is the ticket that congressmen need to make sure that they can raise money from those businesses. So we are architecting tax policy and architecting fiscal and regulatory policy, in part at least to make it easier to raise money. So again, principled conservatives who have as their idea reducing the size of government or simplifying taxes need to realize that in this system for funding campaigns, there is a thumb on the scale against the possibility of simpler taxes or against the possibility of a smaller government, because it never will pay the congressmen who are eager to guarantee a simple way to raise the money they need to fund their campaigns. This system is corruption, and living in this system and expecting changes is insanity. We will never get what we want, on the left or the right, so long as this is the system. And to continue to ignore it and expect change is an instance of what Einstein was talking about. So what should we do? Well, the first thing is to keep focused on the corruption and on its source. For again, the source of this corruption is the gap between the funders, the lesters, and the people. The gap. Because it is this gap that shows not a government dependent upon the people alone, but upon the people and upon these lesters. And when we stay focused on this corruption, we can begin to see the silliness in some of the alternatives to the current campaign finance system that are now being proposed. One idea floated from the Cato Institute and a number of people in the current election cycle on the right is that we should end all campaign regulation. Just eliminate all of it, all limitations on contributions, both direct and indirect, and just mandate immediate disclosure. So we have perfect disclosure, but no limits. But of course, if you remove the limits, you only make the corruption worse. 47 people in the unlimited independent expenditure space have contributed 42% of the money spent by super PACs. 1,000 people have contributed 94% of the individual contributions spent by super PACs. 1,000 people. If you eliminate all limits, all that does is to increase the gap between the lesters and the rest of the people, because what that does is reinforce the business model of raising your money from the very richest to make it easier to fund your campaigns. The corruption only grows in a world without limits. So if no limits doesn't solve the corruption, what would? Well, if the problem here is that the funders are not the people, the only solution to that problem is to make the funders the people. To give Congress away. I don't mean to give them away, nobody would take them, but to give them one way to fund their campaign without Faust, without selling their souls and thereby alienating America, because most Americans, 75% of Americans, believe money buys results in Congress, leading most Americans. Indeed, the latest poll that I saw from ABC and New York Times said 9% of Americans have confidence in this Congress. 9%. It's certainly the case that there were more people, as a percentage, who believed in the British Crown at the time of the Revolution than who believe in this Congress today. So in this face of enormous mistrust, what we need is to give them a way to fund their campaigns so that we have a reason to trust them again. And one way to do this is to adapt a model that's been used by 3 states around the country of voluntary small dollar funded campaigns that are designed to make it possible to win elections without ever taking large contributions from anyone. So you voluntarily opt into this system, but the contributions get amplified so that they never require large contributions from anybody. And the third state to adopt this system, Connecticut, found in the very first year that they adopted this system, 78% of the elected representatives, Republicans and Democrats alike, had used the system to fund their campaigns where they never took a contribution more than $100 and didn't rely at all upon the Lesters to fund their campaigns, but instead funded their campaigns by the people alone. Now, there are lots of ways we could do this, consistent with the Constitution, without any amendment to overturn Citizens United. There's lots of ways we should do this, but the key is to see this is what we have to do. We need a system where only citizens and all citizens, not just the Lesters, are funding our campaign. Now then, let me take this back to President Obama. So why didn't he make this his cause? Why didn't he carry through with the promise that seemed to define him as something different from Hillary Clinton and certainly defined him as the change opportunity for this corrupted system? Well, when I finished my book, Republic Lost, I had this kind of Marshall McLuhan moment. I was sitting at breakfast at a conference, and literally the morning I sent off the final edits, next to me sat down one of the very top leaders of the Obama campaign. We were both at this conference. And I turned to him and I said, okay, so I've just sent this book off, very critical of the president, and I'm sorry I had to be critical. But what was the plan? What were the first 3 steps that you were going to take to change the way Washington works? Obviously, things got in the way, but what was the idea? And my first thought was, it was clear they had no plan, no idea. He said, well, you have to understand, we are in the middle of a crisis. I said, no. You had a candidate who walked on water, you had a supermajority in Congress, and you were in the middle of a crisis. Those are the 3 elements you need to bring about the kind of fundamental change we needed. And then he said, well, there was a moment when Barack Obama got his first budget, and in his budget, there were 9,000 earmarks that Congress had inserted. Earmarks, these little special spending deals that turn out to be deeply tied to those who fund these campaigns most vigorously. And Obama said, I'm going to veto this budget. And as this staffer reported, when Obama said that, his lobbyists told him that if he vetoes that budget and alienates the Democrats, he will never get another bill passed in his first term as president, and his first term will be his last term as president. And you can imagine, even a man who I believe, as he is, a man who really wanted the change he spoke about, you can imagine how awful it must be to be in the position to realize that this system makes it impossible for the president alone to bring about the change he needs. And maybe it's impossible to imagine our president leading to bring about this kind of change. And if it's impossible, then it means this change is not possible. Because we've evolved a political system where we depend upon the leadership of a president to motivate us, to get us to bring the change that we need in our system. And if the system is such that the president can't do it, then we're stuck. And like every great nation in the history of this world, we're about to see our decline before us. But I'm not yet willing to believe we're stuck. I do believe there's a role for a president. I was inspired to think of that role by a story I read about a man who's become a friend, a man named Arnold Hyatt. Hyatt is the former president of Stride Right, which makes great shoes like Keds. He's also a loyal Democrat, and in 1996, he was the #2 largest contributor to the Democratic Party. So in 1997, Bill Clinton invited him and 30 other fat cats to a dinner at the Mayflower Hotel to tell the president what the president should be doing. This was before the Lewinsky scandal, so they thought there was going to be 4 great years of doing something, not frittered away by fighting over the Lewinsky mess. And so there was a great hope that this was the chance for the president to do something. And each person stood up and spoke, and Arnold Hyatt was the last. And Hyatt stood up and he looked the president in his eyes and he said, "Mr. President, I know you're an admirer of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So I want you to put yourself in Roosevelt's shoes in 1940. When he came to realize, reluctantly, that he needed to convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy." Because Hyatt said, "Mr. President, you too have to convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy, but not a war against fascists, a war against the attitude that we fat cats have about government. A war against the idea that merely because you've been successful in the marketplace, you are entitled to pick up the phone and get a senator on the other line. An attitude that says, of course it's obvious that the richest should have dinner with the president, that the president, as he travels around the country, should be having cocktail parties, not with ordinary people to understand what ordinary Americans think about, but with the richest who will fund his campaigns." And you can imagine in that group of 30 fat cats and the president, after Arnold basically announced the president needed to wage war against them, there was some silence after he spoke. The only published account of that evening says that, quote, "Clinton's response effectively slashed Hyatt to pieces, humiliating him in front of that group." Now, I think 15 years later, it's time for us to recognize that it was Arnold Hyatt that night who was right, that we do need a president to convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy. But where Arnold Hyatt was wrong was in his belief that it would be politicians who would wage that war. It won't be. It'll be citizens. It'll be us. It'll be those who have learned the lesson of Thoreau. For every 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil, it will be that one who is striking at the roots. It will be this root striker who gets our nation to recognize that this is the cause we have to fix first if we're going to fix anything else. And that one who will get us to recognize that we too are responsible. Now, let me end with one last story. I'm sure most of you remember in March of 1989 when a ship under the command of Captain Joseph Hazelwood ran aground off of Prince William Sound and spilled about 11 million gallons of oil into the ocean. That was the Exxon Valdez. This is Captain Hazelwood as he called in the accident.
Yeah, it's Valdez back. We should be on your radar there. We've fetched up on the ground north of Goose Island, off Boy Reef. And evidently leaking some oil. And we're going to be here for a while. And if you want, so you're notified, over.
If you want, so you're notified, over. So you're notified, over. Now, I'm sure many of you are wondering a question which was asked at the time. which was Captain Hazelwood drunk when he was captaining a supertanker? He denied it. He said he'd only had 4 vodkas before he got on board, but his blood level alcohol was at a level that said he must have been 6 times the legal limit when he got on board. But they fought it. His lawyers denied it. He was never convicted of it. So let's say there's some doubt. But I want you to forget Hazelwood, or forget the question about whether in fact he was drunk. What there was no doubt about was that he had a problem with alcohol. Mother testified that everyone knew he had a problem with alcohol. 1985, 4 years before the accident, Exxon had treated him for his alcohol problem. 89, after the accident, Exxon's president said, we thought he has mastered the problem. But in 1986, 3 years before the accident, he had his driver's license revoked for a DUI. And in 1988, 1 year before the accident, he had his driver's license revoked again for a DUI. At the time he was captaining a supertanker, he was not allowed to drive a VW Beetle. Okay, but put him aside. What I want you to think about is not Hazelwood. I want you to think about those around Captain Hazelwood. Those other officers, people who could have picked up a phone, people who, while a drunk was driving a supertanker, did nothing. Because of all of those officers, only one took any steps to alert Exxon to the problem of this captain. What do we think about them? Because I ask that question in this way, after talking about this topic, because as I think about this issue of the corruption of this, our Lesterland, I increasingly think that we are they. Our nation faces these critical problems, but we have no institution capable of giving these problems the serious attention they deserve. These institutions are distracted. Distracted as people spend all of their time raising money to get to Congress as opposed to focusing and making decisions based on the merits. They're unable to focus. They're like pilots playing on their laptop instead of flying an airplane, or a surgeon flirting during surgery, or half of you on your cell phone as you're driving your car. We face these critical problems requiring serious attention, but none of our institutions are capable of giving them this attention. And who is to blame for that? Who is responsible? It's too easy to point to the Rob Blagojeviches, to the evil people, to the criminals. They're responsible, no doubt, for their corner of the problem. But more responsible are the good people, the decent people, the people who could have picked up a phone. More responsible are us, we, who are in this the most privileged, are responsible to fix this. Because the most outrageous part is that while these corruptions may have been primed by the most privileged, they have been permitted by the passivity of the most privileged too. When Ben Franklin was carried from the Constitutional Convention in September 1787, he was stopped on the streets of Philadelphia by a woman who said, "Mr. Franklin, what have you wrought?" And Franklin said, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it. A republic, a representative democracy, a government dependent upon the people alone. We have lost that republic. And we have to do something. We all have to do everything to fight to get it back." Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So I'm happy to take questions or abuse first from the right.
I'm Alan Steer, also from Boston. First of all, thank you for your passionate insights into this great problem. I'd like to ask about the Citizens United decision, which seems like a big step backwards in the wrong direction. You've been close to the Supreme Court. Can you help us understand the thinking and what you think?
Sure. So I made it a point not to talk about Citizens United because I think too many people think that Citizens United is the problem. Now, I think it's a terrible decision. I think it's a complete mistake. But the thing we have to remember is that on January 20th, 2010, the day before Citizens United was decided, our democracy was already broken. Citizens United may have shot the body, but the body was already cold. So I'm very committed to getting people to recognize it's more than Citizens United. Now, Citizens United creates a huge problem here because if the Supreme Court means what people think it means, that means that there's no way for Congress to deal with the problem of the Lesters without amending the Constitution. And we have a system where it's practically impossible today to amend the Constitution. To get an amendment through Congress takes 67 senators and two-thirds of the House, 290 votes in the House, and then 3/4 of the states to ratify an amendment. So if that is required to fix this problem, then it's going to be enormously difficult to fix it. But there are steps we can take while we push for the amendment, and many great groups are pushing for an amendment. While we're pushing for an amendment, we can also be changing the way we fund elections through systems like I described, citizen-funded elections. And what we need is a movement that understands it will take more than fixing Citizens United to fix this republic.
Thank you.
Yeah, over here.
What about term limits as a way to also address the fundamental corruption?
So I used to be a strong supporter of term limits. Then I lived in California for 9 years, where they have term limits. And what we saw in California was that term limits produced a legislature that didn't know what the hell it was doing. So it turned to lobbyists for the advice about how to get through what they wanted done. So the lobbyists turned out to have more power in this system than they had in a system without term limits. That's number one. Number two is, in some ways, the problem we have with our current system is a kind of voluntary term limits that has evolved. So Jim Cooper, who is a Democrat from Tennessee, has been in Congress for as long as about 20 other members of Congress. He described the problem to me in this way. He said, the problem with Capitol Hill is it has become a farm league for K Street. K Street, where the lobbyists live. So members and staffers and bureaucrats all have a business model. And their business model is they'll spend some time on Capitol Hill, then they'll cash out and work on K Street. So, my law students, when they graduate and they go to work on a Wall Street firm, get paid about the same amount as members of Congress. But like members of Congress, they hope in 6 or 8 years to become partners and make the big bucks. That's the same thing with congressmen. They are junior associates when they are congressmen, and then they go off after they're in Congress and they become lobbyists. And United Republic calculated that the average salary increase when they left to become lobbyists was 1,452%. So in that system, what they're keen to do is to keep the lobbyists happy. And what that means is the system of corruption is fueled by their desire to keep their future bosses happy too. So I might support term limits as part of a change that includes a change to the way we fund elections, because I do think it's great to have new citizen voices inside of the legislature, but I think on its own, it's not enough to fix the problem.
Thank you.
Hi, I really appreciated your impassioned thing. I've read both your books. I also belong to a Move to Amend, and from Rochester, so I represent that. I've been going to fairs, festivals, getting people to sign petitions, and all sorts of things, town boards, whatever. But what I find is that there's no real outrage. The outrage is not there. It's just like, oh, okay, oh, this is terrible. Thank you for doing what you're doing, and that's it. It requires every citizen to speak out, to do something. And what I was thinking is that instead of politics, is there a way of linking it to something like environmental crisis? I know yesterday we had David Orr talk about how climate collapse is right on the table right now, and our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren are going to suffer from that. Can we override the politics, is what I'm saying, and make this the cause, our life and death of our planet, to say if you politicians don't do what you're supposed to do and there isn't campaign finance reform, we will all die?
Yeah. So, first, you deserve enormous credit for the work that Move to Amend and People for the American Way and others have been doing to raise attention to this issue. This issue doesn't have its own network. We don't have Fox News for crisis of corruption. But if we did, and if they echoed the power of this movement as loudly as it deserves, people would recognize there is an enormous movement out there. More than 400 cities and towns have passed resolutions calling for Congress to reverse Citizens United. 7 states have now passed such a resolution. So the movement is growing, and it's critical, and it echoes a movement of exactly 100 years ago, the progressive movement. And here's the thing people forget about the progressive movement. Progressive movement was not a bunch of lefties. There were progressives on the right and progressives on the left. What progressive meant, people who wanted to change the way the government was functioning, because the government was more corrupt in the more traditional sense of corruption. Back then, as we're complaining about now, they wanted to fix that corruption. So in 1912, presidential election exactly 100 years ago, there are 4 candidates running for president. 2 of them are avowed progressives, Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt. They're very different progressives. They have very different views of what the world should look like. But those 2 candidates together garner 70% of the public's vote because the movement had learned to speak about this issue in a way that didn't make it sound like you had to be a lefty to believe in it or you had to be from the right. And this, I think, is our hardest challenge. Because we've got institutions in this society right now that profit the more they can divide us. They make money by teaching us to hate people on the other side. So whether it's the media, Fox News, MSNBC, or it's the political parties, or even the organizations that are trying to mobilize people. We mobilize people by teaching the people they should hate the Republicans on the other side, or we should hate the Democrats on the other side. And that type of division will make it impossible to achieve anything like a constitutional change, because constitutional change requires cross-partisan support. So I think the hardest thing for us to do is to learn to talk about this in a way that can bring both sides along, to get both sides to recognize we don't have a common end, but we have a common enemy. And the common enemy is this corruption. And if you care about deficits or tax reform, you should be on our team. And if you care about global warming or healthcare, you should be on our team too. And nobody should be allowed to diss or to alienate people because of their substantive views if they believe we need to fix and reform this system. That's the incredibly hard challenge we have. And that comes from us, not the politicians. They get paid to divide us. Only we, the amateurs who don't get paid, can work to bring us back together.
Yeah, hi. You said we shouldn't count on the politicians and we should count on citizens to bring about this change. And I was wondering how you thought about Bradley Manning, who's in prison, facing life imprisonment and possible death sentence for sharing with the world some of the truth behind what's going on with the politicians in various international and national. And anyhow, he's a real hero of mine, so I just was wondering what you thought about it.
Well, so I, too, am deeply troubled by what we seem to know about what, in fact, he has suffered for what he did. Bradley Manning is the question. So Bradley Manning is someone who facilitated the leaks that then became WikiLeaks, and he was a soldier who basically turned this stuff over. And whether you think that's right or wrong, one would have thought that in the 21st century, there was a certain decency that we would have in the way we would prosecute someone who had done wrong. And I think many of us are deeply troubled to see the extremism in the way the government has behaved. And again, not just the Republican government, the Republican and Democratic government both. So I would share your sentiment about Bradley Manning, and it's a way of saying that the problem I'm talking about is not the only problem, but I don't want to draw away from this problem as being a core problem, because until we can get back to a government that we have confidence in, we're not going to have more people who want to be involved in the way you are saying we should be involved to make the government responsive to the values that I think all of us should have.
I'm Bill Howard from Nellis Ford, Virginia. Thank you for an inspiring and sobering sermon. I'd like to know what the first three things are that we should do, and I would say that one of them is not a voluntary tax checkoff. I've been a volunteer tax preparer for 8 years. About 3% of the people that ask, do you want $3 to go to the presidential election campaign fund, say yes. Everybody else laughs.
Yeah. So, so you said I get to do three things. All right. So here's number one. I know because of the way the demographics are that a huge proportion of you show up at speeches and events that politicians participate in. Here's number one. Every one of those events needs to have a question put to those politicians, Republicans and Democrats alike. What are you going to do to end the corruption of this government? Now that's the sort of thing citizens have to do in a non-organized way. It's not like we need, move on to make this happen. It's got to happen in a genuine grassroots way, number one. Number two, you've got to support organizations that are talking and facilitating this kind of change. So whether it's Move to Amend or for some of the branches of the Tea Party, these are also organizations that think we've got to address this fundamental kind of corruption. And you've got to participate in those outside the Beltway type movements. And if there's one idea to support here, there are a lot of us who have an idea of what the change should look like, what the constitutional change should look like, and what the statutory change should look like. But as I think about this more and more, what I think we need more than answers is a process that could bring people to the place that they could believe that something other than a bunch of politicians has come up with an answer that could make sense here. So one idea that was introduced to Congress in July is an idea for Congress to begin to constitute a series of, think of them as like citizen jury conventions. So imagine randomly selecting 300 citizens. It terrifies people, but just hear me out for a second. Randomly selecting 300 citizens. And like a jury, sequestering them. Let's say we pay them enough so that they don't destroy their life if they do this for a week or 2 weeks. Give them the information they need to think about these problems, and let them deliberate about what the right answer looks like. And imagine a series of these. Randomly selected representatives, so they're not picked and controlled by Congress, they're not picked and controlled by any special interest group, they're just us. And if the process is done correctly, what comes out of this type of deliberative process is actually extremely sensible. I am a law professor. I've taught in the most elite law schools for the past 22 years of my life, but I guarantee you, the work that would come out of a randomly selected citizen jury thinking about the changes our Constitution needs is 1,000 times more sensible than the stuff that's coming out of the United States Congress, okay? So that might be because the bar is so low. I don't know what the reason is. But I think actually we, the people, have a capacity, if we're properly informed, to think about these issues. And I want more people to support that idea, to talk about it, to get Congress to think about it seriously, so that we could begin to have a voice that's not just the chattering class on cable television, and it's not just the latest Twitter hashtag. And if you don't know what that means, don't worry, you don't need to know what that means. But is reflective and serious in a way that could actually get us progress on this issue. I can't remember if I'm over here. Yeah.
Tim Oliver, Alexander, Virginia. As far as your concerns about being a minister, I think your ability to shame people for not living up to expectations and inspire them to reach higher, you'll be qualified in any pulpit.
So my work here is done. Thank you very much.
Seriously, I would like your opinion on two things. One, President Obama's policies for his appointed individuals to basically forego the revolving door for serving in his administration, and also your thoughts on how we were able to accomplish the elimination of plus-ups.
Of what?
Of plus-ups in Congress.
Earmarks?
Earmarks.
Yeah, okay, yeah, plus-ups, yeah. So President Obama has a policy to which there have been very significant exceptions. It says that if you've been in his administration, you can't then leave and go to work for the people you've been regulating during the life of the administration. During the life of the administration. So what does that mean? That means, assuming he has a second term, on January 20th, 2017, the day his administration ends, everybody working his administration is free under this ethics rule to step out and then go work for the people they've been regulating. So though it sounds like a great idea, there's no revolving door, it's no real limit on a revolving door for those people who stay with the administration to the end of the administration, right? So I don't think it's good enough. What can you do to deal with earmarks? Well, I told you about this problem that you all recognized, obviously, of the extraordinary polarization in our political system. And this is the issue that I've felt the polarization most fiercely about. We run a group called Root Strikers. We're Thoreau fans. You can join us at rootstrikers.org. But on the list of Root Strikers, we've been trying to motivate people to help teach this issue. And when we've seen reforms that we believe are good, we've praised them, or I've praised them. So I sent out a series of emails to our list praising the Tea Party. When the Tea Party succeeded in blocking Congress from adopting, for a period of time, any of these earmarks, then they've fallen back and no longer is that resolve as firm as it was. But there was a period of time when they did that. And unbelievable number of people on our list said, I will have nothing to do with you again as long as you say anything nice about the Tea Party. You're the enemy if you say anything nice about the Tea Party. So this sort of brings out the sense in which it's really hard to get people to think outside of the partisan division. But beyond the Tea Party, what would end this system? If you change the way campaigns are funded, the push for earmarks changes dramatically. Right now, earmarks are part of the currency of influence, part of the currency. So, it's never quid pro quo, it's never illegal, it's never so crude. But Congressman happens to get your college on the board of which you sit, some special fund. The next week, telephone call comes to you as a board member. So you see the work Congressman Smith has been doing to help your college. Now we need your help for Congressman Smith. It's part of the currency of the way campaigns get funded. If we change the way campaigns are funded, we might still have earmarks, but they're not going to be earmarks driven by these kinds of campaigns, these kind of concerns for campaigns. So I think changing funding is the first step, the crucial step to making it possible to change the concepts of earmarks.
Yeah, my wife, who's in the audience over on the other side there, has studied this all the way back to the Greeks and the Romans and the Athenians, complaining, how do we get money out of politics? So what you're talking about is nothing new. How do we stop for instance, Obama was given $47 million by the trial bar before he was even elected, so obviously we're not going to have any tort reform. So how do you stop the big, whoever it is, whether it's the AMA or the trial bar, whoever, without crossing constitutional lines to limit the big money that comes in?
Okay, so first really important point. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've been fighting the problem of money in politics forever, but it is really different today. It is radically different today. Here's one little example to get you a sense of how different it is. In 1982, Senator John Stennis, who was no choir boy, but Senator John Stennis is chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee for the Armed Services Committee. so Armed Services Committee he runs. A colleague asks him to have a fundraiser for defense contractors. John Stennis replies, "Is that appropriate? Is it proper? I hold life and death over these defense contractors. I don't think it's appropriate for me to raise money from them." 1982. That utterance is literally impossible to imagine any committee chairman saying today, because to be a committee chairman is to demonstrate your capacity to raise money from the people you are regulating. Indeed, both parties auction off committee chairmanships on the basis of who's going to be able to raise the most money from the people who they are actually regulating. So this is a system that, in my view, began to change dramatically when Congress became competitive. So that should be a reason to hope, because it's actually not so long ago that it was a different set of problems we were worried about. You know, there are problems, but a different set of problems. That's number one. So number two, what would actually change that system? Again, the only way to change the world where concentrated interests, whether it's on the right or the left, have enormous influence, is to change the way we fund elections. So in my book, I describe something I call the Grant and Franklin Project. So here's the way that works. You first of all have to stipulate with me, and I could prove it, but just let's believe it for a moment. Every American voter sends at least $50 of revenue to the federal treasury. You know, whether that's income tax or Social Security tax or cigarette tax, whatever, we all send at least $50 in. And with that first $50, under this system we say, let's rebate that $50 in the form of a democracy voucher, which you can use to give to any candidate if that candidate says he or she will only fund with democracy vouchers plus, let's say, contributions of up to $100. So Grant, $50, Franklin, $100. Every voter having a $50 voucher would produce $7 billion in the election system. That's 3 times the total amount spent in Congress in 2010. So it's real money, but it's money that comes from all of us, as opposed to money that comes from the tiniest fraction of us. And I think that's the critical dynamic that we've got to introduce if we're going to change the way in which the tiniest fraction of us, the Lesters, can corrupt the system in the way that they currently do. Should we have one more?
One more question.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, I'm Helen Friedman from New York City, and I work with an organization that is constantly striving to affect change. We're addressing so many issues, radical Islam in this country, the socialist drive, etc. We hit a wall of an ultra-liberal media that doesn't publicize our point of view, an ultra-liberal school system, the academic world, where we see that on the college campuses there's a totally different direction that's in place. So how does the citizen who wants to be involved, who doesn't want to be the passive bystander but wants to be involved, how can we affect change?
Yeah, so you know, I feel the same kind of frustration about the issue I care about. You know, polls show that for the first time in as long as they've been taking polls, the issue of corruption in government is either number 2 or number 3 in the most important issues that a government should face. So from the standpoint of what the people think, this issue is right at the top. But we will literally have a presidential campaign where this issue will not once get mentioned by either side. Either side. We don't even talk about it. There won't be one policy position that either party puts out about this issue, because it's too embarrassing for Obama to talk about it, and it's just not within the political philosophy of Romney to talk about it. So the dominant political force here has no interest in addressing what the people actually care deeply about. Now, when you get this, when you understand it, and you obviously have the same sense of frustration, it begins to elicit in people the feeling that it's hopeless. I write about this at the end of my book. I was at Dartmouth, and a woman stood up and She said, "Okay, you've convinced me, Professor. There's no hope here. There's nothing we can do. We are lost, and there's no possible change." And the academic in me thought, "Yeah, she's right. She's right. There's nothing we can do." But when she said this, and I read about this, she said this, and I had this image of my then 6-year-old son. And I don't know why, the image was of a doctor saying to me, "Your son has terminal brain cancer, and there's nothing you can do." And I thought, well, would I do nothing? And that's, of course, a recognition of what love is. Right? Love is acting against all odds. The odds are not relevant. It's not the question. It's just, what do you need to do next? And then I made the next step in thought, which was a recognition that even we liberals love this country. Love this country. We love this country. And what loving this country should mean is against all odds. The odds are not relevant. We will do whatever the hell it takes, regardless of whether it can work. So we face similar problems. I don't know how to solve either of them, but I do know what the next steps are, whether we can win or not. The next step is the love that it takes for all of us, the love that all of us have, that we can leverage to restore, to find again this lost republic. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks.